You are now doing less once again with John and Jeff. Welcome back. A lot has happened since we've last addressed you all do less podcast listeners, namely the U.S. election. So we'll go ahead and talk about that briefly. I haven't really been following the details too much in depth. I know there's a lot of broad kind of stories going on. Specifically claims of fraud. But I guess, Jeff, I think you've been following that stuff a little bit closer. Do you want to kind of take us up to date with what's been happening with the U.S. election as far as like fraud claims?
Yes.
Voter fraud?
So I would say there's a 99% probability that Joe Biden won at this point. That I'm just pulling that number out of my ass. But like, it's, most of the media has called it for him. It looks to be pretty settled, but there is some claims going around of voter fraud. Specifically, Donald Trump has been claiming it's not over, that he's not just claiming that there's fraud, but he's claiming that he won and that the fraud will prove it. So I don't think that claim seems too far, like there's no way he could know that. So I think he's just saying that in a very Trump fashion. But as to the claims of fraud, I think there's not nothing there. So apparently there's some like sworn affidavits by actual official like election like officer type people who have said, there's like they've backdated ballots and some other sort of things. And so it's not nothing. It deserves to be investigated. Check it out. Like the way I see it, the more transparent, the better, right? Like why should we want it not investigated? Because if there was something wrong, we want to know. And if there wasn't something wrong, we want to know so we can put it to rest. I don't really see much harm in investigating it. And I mean, if you don't like Trump and you're happy with the results, it's basically his time that he could be spending doing other things with the remaining time of his presidency that he's going to be spending investigating fraud. So you might as well, I guess, if you think there is this low probability that there is any, or even if there was, that it's likely to swing the election or not, you might as well have him waste his time trying to figure this out. So I really don't see any harm in investigating it. But I mean, my take is, honestly, I don't think it matters. Because to me, whether or not there was fraud or wasn't, I don't think is really the main issue here. And, I think you probably agree with me on that.
Yeah, so my extent of what I've been seeing is, Trump, I follow him on Twitter, and he's been tweeting about stuff like how he thinks that he won certain states, that there's been fraud. And every time he tweets, there's like a little banner or like literally Twitter will like cover his tweet and say, no, this is disputed, or this isn't right. Here's the facts. And then they just post like something from, Reuters or whatever, another source. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, I think that's just such a bad look. Like Twitter, like you said, like if there's something to be investigated, I don't know why the opinion isn't of everyone to just, let's get it out of the way. Like I do understand with Trump, he's pretty much a misinformation, kind of person. Like that's like his whole MO is just like to spin the truth the way he wants it to be. But this is like an actual chance to be like, look, we have this rigorous process, we have this or that kind of way to verify it, so let's do it. Let's actually show you this is our time to like bring the truth to light. But instead they're just trying to paper over it. And I think it's like really a bad look. And I think that a lot of people are agreeing with me and in that thought, because for example, Parler, which is like the alternative to Twitter, is like the #1 downloaded app, currently. So I think that that's going to be a bad outcome for Twitter, that they're trying to take this so off, trying to take the authority in this way. I think that that's very bad for them doing. I think they're going to have to pay for that.
Yeah, I think that's a very bad business decision, because the reality is Twitter is a very simple app to make. Like you or I could make a Twitter copy in a pretty short amount of time. It's the technology is not that complicated. What it has going for it is the network effect. And I think we might have talked about this before on the podcast. And essentially, this is getting a little off topic, but there's power in networks. And the more people you have in a network, it grows non-linearly, the power of the network. So it's really hard for other networks to compete with larger networks, because even if they're like half as big, they're significantly less powerful. So I think Twitter is making a huge mistake here, because by editorializing everything the president says, like even if it is without a doubt false, that's not the point of the Twitter app. The point is you say whatever you want, and like people follow it or don't follow it, and they just choose like to ignore that information or whatever. It's not, I don't go on Twitter for Twitter's opinions. I go on Twitter for other people's opinions aggregated in one place. So I don't need them editorializing everyone I follow. And so to me, it actually defeats the point of the app if they're going to really lean into this. And I think that, like you said, opens up potential for competitors. And if their competitor gets big enough, they could lose everything, because it's kind of these all or nothing type apps. So it could be catastrophic, I think, to them. But I just find it obnoxious, because it's very condescending. It's like, even if I know that what he's saying is a lie, the fact that you feel the need to tell me that is very like infantilizing, I feel like, to the user. And that's just not a pleasant experience, I feel like, for most people. But I digress. I think, again, going back to the claims of fraud, the reason I'm saying it doesn't matter, and then people might be like, whoa, like, I can't believe you'd say that. Like, fraud, that's a big deal. Like, I would say both sides would agree that seems like a big deal. The reason I say it doesn't matter is because, let's say there's no fraud at all. We figured it out, no fraud. And election was decided by a few percentage points. And that leaves roughly 70 million Americans extremely unhappy. No matter which way this thing goes, there's 70 million Americans, roughly, on both sides, who are pissed. And they're pissed they have to live 4 years under a strong central power that fundamentally disagrees with them on just about everything they see, in, like, more so from a culture perspective than a policy, because I would actually argue that the policy is not that far from each other, but culturally are just completely, like, there's no overlap, I feel like, at this point. And so do we really feel as a nation it's this good idea to try to squeak out a few percentage point majority over the other side every 4 years, and then just hammer the other side with whatever it is we want, knowing full well if they win the next time, they're going to hammer us with everything they want? This seems like a completely sort of idiotic ritual we do every 4 years.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like I kind of said at the beginning, I haven't really been following, because I don't really know a lot about voting logistics. So like, I don't really know. I can't, I'd kind of be stepping out of my lane to try to say, oh, this isn't right, this is right. I don't really pay attention to that. But what I do know about is liberty. And what I know about as far as liberty is, you should really care about if your liberty is being infringed upon. And what I know about Trump and what I know about Biden is both of them are going to infringe upon your liberty pretty significantly. It doesn't matter which one, though. It's just going to be one of them.
Right.
So I think that this is actually a really important time, because every election that I've been alive for or kind of been knowledgeable about, you kind of say this stuff beforehand, before the election. You say, hey, doesn't this kind of suck? This all doesn't make sense. Why are we voting for the lesser of two evils kind of thing? And people say, yeah, everyone agrees with that, but we have an election to deal with, We have to get this election over with, and then we can worry about that. But then the election is over, and then they're like, it doesn't matter anymore. They don't, you try to talk to them about liberty, and then they're just like, talk to me next election time. And it's like, you're never going to care at that point, because you're just always just going to wait till it gets too late and then say, oh, I have to deal with this. I have to vote for the lesser of two evils. But right now is an interesting time because the election is over, but we're actually not done dealing with it. It's still in the news. It's still around, and everybody's still talking about it. So it's actually a perfect time to really hammer down what we'll try to do today on this episode, which is that this election, the election process of a centralized government is not the right way to do it. We have to take the time and really, while it's at the forefront of everyone's minds, talk about how voting for this central power that's become way too strong is actually makes no sense. Like you were starting to talk about how 70 million people are going to be upset either way. What if it didn't have to be that way? So let's talk about how we could make it so that it wouldn't just be 70 million people upset and then waiting 4 years until the other 70 million people are upset.
Right. So essentially it comes down to like aggregating, right? The problem here is an aggregation problem. So we have, essentially half the country leans one political direction, the other half leans another. But it's not like it's completely evenly dispersed and like a perfectly mixed medium, right? There are some states that are far more right-leaning and some states that are far more blue-leaning. Really, the divide is actually almost perfectly rural versus urban, but it's kind of hard to draw lines like that. So I don't know that would work. But essentially, if you split up the country into groups, then let every state, just say we split it up by state, and every state basically picks an equivalent of a president. Like their governor essentially becomes as powerful as the president is, but only for their state, right? So you have basically each governor basically gets promoted to president of their state, essentially. You're going to have a lot more people represented by the thing they choose, right? If we have the entire nation aggregating, you're going to basically have 50% of the people pissed every single time. But if you divide it up by state, you might drop that number down to only, maybe 25% of Americans are dissatisfied with their electoral outcome. So just the factor of aggregation versus decentralizing alone can get people much more satisfied with the results of political elections.
Yeah, I always like to mention like the leaning each way, leaning left, leaning right. Something you don't hear often is like both sides are right. Like when you're in a densely populated urban environment, it actually makes sense to have like a more centralized, unified, voice kind of that would organize things and would would handle stuff that wouldn't necessarily be as efficiently handled by the free market. People that live in cities that want that are not wrong to want that. Mm-hmm. And people that live in rural areas that don't, that live 10 miles from their nearest neighbor and their only interaction with the government is, filing their taxes every year. they're not wrong to say, why am I taxed so much? Why can't you tax me less? Why won't you say less about my life and I'll just leave you guys alone if you leave me alone? Both of those sides are right. It really does come down to, how densely populated of an area do you live in, and how much interaction do you actually need with like a central planner. So it's like, it's kind of foolish for either one of those sides to take to take control over the other and say, by the way, us over here, we determine what the right answer is, and by the way, we have control over you, so we're going to tell you what to do. You really have to give each person the respect and the dignity to make their own decision, and you would get some widely differing results, I'm sure, if you allow different groups, as you say, to take it into their own hands, like the governors of states, for example. Depending on how they choose to rule, you'll get a lot of different outcomes in terms of output, in terms of voter satisfaction, in terms of quality of life. You could just start measuring all this stuff, and then let people decide what they like and what how they'd like to vote would actually be with their feet. They would actually be able to move around to the areas that they more aligned with, as opposed to having to just be subjected to the wills of whoever was able to get 70 million plus one votes instead of 70 million minus one.
Right. And yeah, the voting with your feet thing, I think this is extremely important, because essentially the way all things improve is via slow grinding iteration. This is the case for everything. Basically, everything we do as humans is trial and error. And the more trials you have, the better the outcome you're going to get in the end. This is just the case with everything. And so with governments, the kind of main problem is we don't have any trial and error, right? We're trying to decide if we want, universal healthcare. I feel like is this big issue, whereas like most people on the left want it, and most people on the right don't. And so we're deciding for the entire country whether or not we should all have universal, healthcare or not. And we as a country have never attempted it before, and we're trying to do this thing for 300 million people. And the reality is we could just divide up this among state lines, and then just say, okay, California, try universal healthcare. Texas, you don't, right? You can actually roll back some of the healthcare stuff that's been done on a federal level. So you can actually, go the other direction. And then let people decide where they want to live. If California is super awesome and the healthcare for all is amazing, then yeah, go live there. And if that's what you love, go live there. If you don't want that, if you want more of a free market approach, then, you can live in Texas. And then it's like, now basically both states are happy. You can have the case where both states walk away happy if you just agree to disagree. But if you decide you want to fight each other and winner take all, one is guaranteed to walk away unhappy. This is a zero-sum game. And so the fewer zero-sum games you play, the better off we can all be.
Yeah. Trial and error, that's a really good point. I wanted to bring up like kind of the analogy of like, everyone learns in high school what the importance of trials and controlling for confounding variables. So for example, an experiment that you probably ran in high school was like trying to like grow a plant, or some kind of science experiment. It doesn't really matter what. If you want to measure the effect of whatever the variable is, sunlight or water or nutrients in the soil of growing a plant, well then you'll do 3 different pots where you vary each variable. You'll have one variable that you change from one to the other, and then the difference between the two will really give you a taste of what that variable's impact on the plant is. And you also want to do it, even for the same variable, you want to do it many times so that you don't have any like strange aberrations that aren't actually due to the thing you're trying to study. You're trying to control for all that as best as possible. You don't just go in and take all of your seeds and just mix them up into one soil and then do a little bit of sunlight and do a little bit of nutrients just all throughout. And then just like, afterwards it's like, wow, this worked out terribly. None of my plants grew. And you're like, what could I have done better? How can I know how to grow plants in the future? And it's like, you gotta take it one at a time and do different trials and control it like a science experiment.
Right. And so, this might sound all good in theory, but you might be like, oh, but like, that could never happen. But actually it could. It's actually not that unreasonable to expect that if enough people got behind this idea of sort of decentralization, essentially secession. I know secession sounds like a dirty word because it's like tied to the Civil War, which was about slavery for the most part, but it doesn't have to be about that, right? Like it's just because it was about that once doesn't mean it's always about that. And so a great example of this, if you look at, to me, a more important result than the presidential election, which honestly I care less about, was the fact that many states across the board legalized various kinds of drugs. In New Jersey, we have marijuana being legalized for recreation. And even in Oregon, you have like heroin, LSD, and all sorts of other drugs being, I think, decriminalized, not necessarily legalized. I think marijuana probably got legalized, but the harder drugs got decriminalized. And I think that's fantastic. And the reality is, the federal government says no to drugs. If we were just looking at what the federal government said, then drugs would be illegal. But states are saying no to the federal government, and they're saying we're going to have it be legal anyway, because that authority should not fall under them anyway by the Constitution. So the states have every right to delegate that power for themselves. And you just take this and you extend it to everything. It doesn't. I think you wouldn't be able to do it with the military. There would actually be an issue there. But with a lot of other stuff, I think it's there's a legitimate path towards getting more of what you want in your state.
Yeah, I mean, military is kind of a tough one, and it's like something we could probably do a whole nother episode about. Yeah. But just the notion that we kind of operate under, it's like we need to have the most powerful military in the world. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we're susceptible to attack or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, what if we find out that not having the biggest military in the world makes us go to war less, stuff right. Like that. Like there's all sorts of different trade-offs that you don't know if you're always just one way and right. Everyone has to go with one way. Having like states maybe with like different size militaries, it's like, yeah, the states with the lowest military got invaded and the states with the highest military were just at war all the time. But then the states with like the right amount
spent all their money on fighting.
Yeah. Right. And all their children died in the war. Which, so it's like, oh, there's actually an optimum point of, military spending that you would actually, you could just look at Europe and like already see how they do it. But yeah, that's a whole nother topic to go into.
Right. And so, I mean, to me, there's really actually no downside to decentralizing. I think there is a theoretical downside to decentralization, but it happens at the limit of not enough central government. And to me, that limit would be in like a place like Somalia, where it's literally just a complete power vacuum all the time, and there's like always just infighting and civil war constantly, and like just you can never establish businesses there because you can't have property rights if there's like you don't know if you're gonna hold on to it for like whenever. So it like that to me is where the limit of okay, we have to question whether it's safe to decentralize here. It's patently obvious we are not near that point.
Yeah, right. The federal government ceding its ability to set the tax rate for every adult in the whole country. Losing that ability wouldn't send us into utter chaos.
Right.
I'll guarantee it. They have a long way to go beyond that.
I'll put my entire life savings behind that bet.
Right.
So to me, that, is sort of like a zero downside kind of thing that we could make happen if, we as people decide we want it badly enough, and then essentially, get people in the federal office who are just basically going to cut federal power across the board and allow states to pick up the slack. But really, I think where I would even want to take it is to another level, which is to say, even if we decentralize on a state level, I would question whether even democracy is even a good thing. If we decentralize, we already established you get more people getting what they vote for. So you're going to get sort of like a more democratic result. And you could even do things like ranked choice voting to get even closer to the will of the people, or the will of the majority, really. But I'd like to question whether that's even a good thing. And I'll give sort of a trite example, but I think it illuminates that it's not necessarily immediately obvious that getting what the majority wants is a good thing. Let's say you're just out to dinner with your friends, and at the end of the dinner, you could all sort of split the bill and sort of pay for your own check. And that would be sort of kind of like the equivalent of like capitalism, right? Like everyone just sort of is responsible for their own individual choices. But let's say everyone goes, no, let's put it up to a vote. Let's do this democratically. And then, a majority of your friends, say 4 of them, there's 8 of you, and they pick you, and so there's only 3 left to pick anyone else. Or let's say there's 7 of you, whatever, and 4 of them pick you, and they're like, yeah, we voted. You got to pay for the whole thing. Would you think that's fair? Would anyone think that's fair? It's like, that's completely unfair. That's obviously unfair. And you'd be pissed that your friends just ganged up on you and said, you're paying for the bill. And you might be like, this is BS. I'm not doing this. I'm not paying for the bill. And they'd be like, hey man, that's democracy. We voted. Okay. Are you anti-democratic? It's clearly absurd in right. That sort of trite example, but you can apply it, that same sort of concept, to a higher level and say, in stuff that doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, why are we voting on it?
Right.
If there is that sort of market option where it's like we all just pay for our own bill or whatever, yet that didn't need to get put up to a vote. It just was put up to a vote because people wanted to put it up to a vote, and then achieved a zero-sum result that catered to the majority and screwed everyone else over. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like that analogy, and kind of to even take it further to illustrate where we are with our democracy in the U.S. Our democratic process. We don't have a democracy in the U.S. per se, but the idea of voting for, say, a president, to apply to that analogy, it's like if that person says like, hey, I don't want to pay for dinner. Like, is it okay for all the people to, well, say before you voted, let's just say everyone just decided, hey, we want you to pay for dinner if you don't mind. And they say, I do mind. Please don't make me pay for dinner. It's, there's a lot of people here. And they say, like, would you say it's okay to use violence on that person to pay for? If it's not immediately obvious that it is, because that's pretty crazy, if you like rework the scenario so that you say, okay, you don't want to pay, so let's vote. And then you vote, and then it's like, okay, we decided you are the one that needs to pay. And it's just like, he doesn't want to pay. So now is it okay to use violence because you all voted? Like, is that the point where what makes it okay? If everybody's on the same page, does that make it okay to use violence? If that scenario still seems absurd, that's actually pretty close to what we have in the US. If you're against the tax law or any one of the numerous federal impositions on your life, but you decide to disobey it, we as a country are like just okay with the government using violence on you to get you to follow the federal mandate that's in effect.
Right. And if you think John's being hyperbolic here, he's not, right? Let's just take the drug war, for example. I do not want to fund the drug war, but I do because I have to. And I don't get to just say, I'm going to give you taxes for this, this, and this, but I don't want one single penny going to this stupid drug war or even these foreign wars. I don't get to say that. I just pay my taxes, or someone comes to my door with a gun and says, pay your taxes or we're taking you to prison and we're going to throw you up and lock you in there. And if I say, no, I'm not going to prison, I'm not doing that, they will force me. And if I fight back, they will kill me. So it's not hyperbolic to say violence is the way we achieve our democracy isn't any more civilized than any other executive action. It just reflects the majority of people. But ultimately, the way you enforce any law is with violence. And so the question people need to ask themselves much more often is, okay, do I want this thing? Yes. But do I want this thing bad enough? Is it important enough that I feel it's okay to stick a gun to people who disagrees with me to get it done? Is it justified in that manner? And I think if more people thought like that, a lot less laws would exist. There would be some kind of sociopaths that'd be like, yeah, who cares? Like, just kill who you need to kill. But I think most people are decent. And if they realize that, would not feel okay being like, oh, like 3 charter schools at most. And it's like, what if I want to start a 4th charter school? Well, then we're going to show up with some guns and, put that to rest,
Right. And just in case, so in that example, if you're still not, in that analogy, if you're still not sold, because you might be a person that like hears that and says, well, if that person has the most money, for example, then it makes sense. And if they have the most money by a lot, then it makes even more sense for them to pay. Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit to another example that's kind of similar. Let's say you're playing a board game. The one that comes to my mind is called Scattergories. If you're familiar with that game, it's pretty open to interpretation, what you put down as your answer. And if you put down an answer that somebody disagrees with as an acceptable answer, as per the rules, you vote. Everybody votes on it, right? So in a close game, if you put something down and someone challenges you, and you're say 1 point away from winning, or you're just winning by some amount, then the people that you're playing with have the incentive to vote against you, right? That's just an example where, like, yeah, you can, like, I mean, you play with people that are your friends and your family, so you're coming from like a neutral perspective. But once you start playing, there's that, you want to win, and it's like you're directly disincentivized to vote like according to an actual unbiased perspective when you stand to lose. But when it's very much appealing in that moment to say, well, this person's beating me by 4 points. If they get this one, then they win. If they don't, then I have a really good chance to win. And then so, you're lying if that doesn't come into your mind when you're taking the vote. So when it comes to voting for a president, it's no different than that. There's all sorts of incentives that can creep in that keep you from being this unbiased civil contributor or whatever you kind of think of yourself as when you go to place your vote.
Yeah.
Like, you have your own incentives that may be directly opposed to someone else, and to oppose yourself onto them, it's pretty immoral, especially when you introduce violence into the mix.
Right. And that's the key thing to remember is the things you believe in, if you're putting them into politics, I would say you are using violence to enforce them. You may not be personally doing it, but someone is doing it on your behalf, and you should take that into consideration. Like, I use the drug war a lot. Like, I don't like drugs. I think they're very bad for society. Like, I think, they ruin a lot of people's lives. And, I would rather people not do them for the most part. I think some are okay, but like, there's a lot I would just rather people not do. But I'm not comfortable walking up to someone doing drugs and putting a gun to their head and saying, put it down or else. That stretches beyond the limit of my comfort zone. And so if you just apply that analogy across the board to everything you believe in, I think a lot more things are going to fall through. Maybe some things do stay the same. If you're of the belief that climate change is as much of an existential threat to all of us as I think a lot of people do believe, then maybe it is actually justified to put a gun to someone's head and say, limit your carbon output. If it truly is, a sort of existential threat to us all. And so I think there are use cases where it is actually violence is justified, and it's acceptable to use the power of a centralized force to control things. But I think the set of all things that fall under that sort of category is all the zero-sum games. So another example is borders, right? Our country has essentially one border, if you think about it as like, we have Alaska and Hawaii, but just think about like mainland America. That border is a continuous border all the way around, right? And so you can't really have some states saying we're open borders and other states saying we're closed borders. Because that's not really, unless the states have their own borders and they're enforced across other states. But let's just say we don't have that as the case. And basically, if people are coming in, it's up to that U.S. border. That's a zero-sum game, right? You basically all need to decide whether we're going to be relatively open border or less open border or whatever. You gotta figure out and what most people want, and suddenly democracy is actually a sensible way to go about that sort of thing. But even if you decentralize, then you can have more borders, and then more people can get more of what they want. So it's decentralization is still better in that example. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a good framework. Not to undermine, so this whole episode is about how to best preserve liberty, I'll say, in the face of democracy and in the face of strong central government. And I think that's very important to know as a citizen. That should be like the number one thing to preserve. But then I guess kind of back to what I said earlier about how Donald Trump versus Biden, like what's the details, what's every minute I'm going to refresh Twitter. And on that, I really, my latest advice is just turn it off. Like all this stuff, it's just not good for you. It does, like when it comes to this outcome, it's more like a celebrity kind of game going on rather than or actually more like a sports team. It's like it's honestly like a sports, like one side versus the other, cheering for your side, cheering against the other team. I think everyone should just really refocus on their own on their own life, what does the government really impose upon you? Think about those things. Think about if it's all beneficial to you, and what specifically can you do in your own life to impact your own life, which is a lot more than what the government can do to impact your life. Again, that's assuming that your liberty is not being infringed upon, but anything short of that, you really need to focus less on these crazy old people in Washington that are just creating all this nonsense, and really kind of focus on the stuff that's important to you and what really matters.
Right. And I think if you focus on yourself, not only is it going to make your life better, probably make your mental health better, but it'll make you realize that not everything needs to be put up to a vote, right? Because you're just going to sort of do what it is you want to do. And as long as you're not hurting anybody else, I don't think you're going to care very much what other people are doing and how they feel. Because it doesn't matter. You don't need to put up everything to a vote. Some things can just be agree to disagree. You don't have to say, no, it's one way or the other, and we're going to figure this out. And so I think that's sort of like a toxic mentality to have, that winner take all mentality. And, I would bet it's a function of the size of government. I think our government's gotten too big, and so the stakes have gotten too high. And that's why everyone is so emotionally invested in this thing, is because it's just such a big part of our lives, whether we like it or not. And I think the reality is even the people who may be more pro-government, I think in all honesty would probably be a bit happier if they had less government in their lives, because they could still have the things that it is that they want without government necessarily providing it. And so that's kind of where I stand.
Yeah, that's a really good argument. Another argument for limited government is, like, people aren't dumb. So when they run the efficiency algorithm of like calculating, like, if I want this to be the case, should I do something myself or should I just go vote? And it's like, when you can just vote, and it's more, and you'll have more power if all the people who think like you get together and vote on it, then otherwise having to, all the people that think like you just go out and convince the people that are directly around you to, like, with a positive incentive rather than with a law incentive, voted into power. A smaller government allows that incentive to switch the other way, to be like, yeah, I could go vote on this, but the government's not power enough to get this done. It's actually the people like me who believe in a certain thing to go out and actually convince others, and to make it more of a potential, make the potential outcome that you want more of more viable.
Right. And I think people tend to forget that everything we have is in a constant state of production. So there's this sort of perceived static amount of wealth or stuff out there, but it's not static. We have this constant state of consumption and production. And so it's an equilibrium that is roughly the same value. The amount of wealth slightly grows over time, but it feels almost constant. And so I feel like there's like this just pile of stuff out there, and it's just waiting to be divided up. But the reality is it's in a constant state of production and consumption all the time, every day. And it takes all of us going to work every day and putting our best foot forward and doing the best job we can to collectively, produce what it is we have to enjoy. And, you can play ticky-tack here with the laws and fiddle with this and fiddle with that, but ultimately our standard of living falls upon us. We can't just rewrite the rule book to all give us more. You can't just magically create, more energy for all of us, more stuff for all of us. You can't just vote it to be so. And so, this idea that government is really the path to prosperity is kind of a nonsense one. It's a non-starter, because the reality is it's up to all of us individually to go out and produce and make what it is that we need to enjoy our lives. And so, it's not so important what the government's doing, because the government doesn't really do all that much for us. We do it ourselves. And I think it's important to remember that.
That's a good place to end, I think.
All right.
You have anything else to say?
Nah, I think I'm good.
Sweet.
All right.
Thanks for listening. Tune in next time on Do Less.
Keep doing less.
Bye.